All right. Yeah, I'll go ahead and get started then. We're good to go. All right. Hey, everybody. Thank you for making it out super early. I know it was tough for me to roll out of bed, so thank you for making the effort. I'm MC Williams. I'm the host of the Myths Your Teacher Hated podcast, a long running podcast that tells the stories of myths, legends, and folklore from around the world with all of the sex and violence left in. Today's panel is going to be a little more family friendly because, it is early. But we are still going to talk about a lot of original stories. We are talking today about Cinderella. But before we get started, I want to first thank Blueberry, who's been the sponsor of the DC Digital Media track. They've provided a lot of assistance, and it's been great having them as our sponsor. And I also want to mention that our charity this year is Big Brothers Big Sisters of Atlanta. This is a place that is very near and dear to me personally. I've been big with them for the last 3 years. I can personally attest to the great work that they do, the opportunities that they give us, and the ways they help us to support the littles that we are matched with in order to provide people with opportunities they otherwise wouldn't have, and one-on-one individual relationships that are long-lasting, which is really great to be able to offer. And Dragon Con is going to be matching dollar for dollar up to $100,000. So yeah, feel free to donate that money. And if you have the time and the interest, feel free to reach out to them about possibly being a big. It's a great experience. It's very rewarding. All right, so you probably already know the story. It's one of the oldest and most famous stories ever told, as well as one of the most famous animated Disney films in the classic era. I'm speaking, of course, of Cinderella. It's a ubiquitous story with at least 100 different versions of the story on film, depending on how loose of an adaptation you're willing to accept, such as Cinderella. More than a few of which are Disney because they just keep coming back to that cash cow. The very first version was all the way back in 1899, which was a short film by George Méliès that was a critical flop. All the way back, there were already critical flops. The first animated version was unsurprisingly by Disney, but it is not the one that you're thinking of. It was actually a 7-minute short film from 1922 that was later adapted and expanded into the 1950 classic animated film, whose castle still graces their logo. My original intention with this panel was to discuss the story partially in context with the brand new Camila Cabello film that is coming out today. It kept getting pushed back and pushed back and pushed back, and so I have not seen it because it wasn't out. But we are going to talk about several other existing versions because, as I said, there are plenty to talk about. So, to start off with, we're going to get into the story that everyone probably knows, which is the animated version that set kind of the standard for what Cinderella is and how the whole story works. So Cinderella's mom dies and her dad remarries the wicked stepmother, bringing along the 2 wicked stepdaughters. The stepmother is, of course, wicked. That's why she's the wicked stepmother. They're very on the nose in the old stories, which makes Cinderella become a servant in her own home. And they force her to go live in the attic. When it's cold, she goes and sleeps by the hearth for warmth, making her covered in ashes, which is where she gets her nickname. There's lots of abuse, but of course, Cinderella stays good and kind and true and loving through it all because she's just that good a person. The king eventually throws a ball to find a bride for the prince, who is not super interested about it. He doesn't want to get married for affairs of state. He wants to marry for love. And they're like, no, you're a prince. You don't get to do that. So the stepmother and the stepdaughters find out about the ball and they get super excited. They buy lavish dresses for themselves with her dad's money, but not for Cinderella because she no longer matters. The stepmother offers up a fake bargain, one of the few elements from the Grimm brothers version. If she completes an impossible set of tasks, she can go. With the help of the forest creatures, she gets the job done, alters her mother's dress into a serviceable gown, and is on her way just as they're all out the door. But the wicked stepmother lives up to the name Wicked Stepmother and destroys her dress just because, and breaks her own bargain because, again, she's the wicked stepmother. That's what she does. It's right there in the name. So enter the fairy godmother who makes a coach, a coachman, a new dress, and shoes out of the ordinary items just kind of lying around. And off Cinderella goes to the ball with a warning that the magic ends at midnight, a mystical time where a lot of things die and reborn, so magic can't cross that threshold. So as the mystery woman no one knows, not even her stepfamily, somehow, she's just in a dress, guys. She's the same person. She charms the prince and wins his heart in about, 3 hours. That's all it takes. And they fall madly in love, and everything is peaches and cream, and then the clock strikes midnight. Oopsie. And so she has to flee before the prince sees her turn back into her true self in rags and dirty ashes, and she doesn't want him to see that because he's a prince and he's not going to be into that. The prince, of course, immediately orders his men to scour the kingdom, and they find a single glass shoe sitting on the steps, which must belong to the mystery woman because she left a shoe behind, which stayed on her foot during all the dancing, but the running apparently was just too much. The wicked stepmother, who eventually does figure out that it was Cinderella, eventually, with a lot of help, tries to lock Cinderella away back in the attic so the stepdaughters can marry the prince instead, but the animals come back to the rescue, freeing her just in time to try on the slipper, which of course fits perfectly because it is her shoe. Cue music, roll credits, happily ever after. Most of the modern versions of Cinderella at least loosely follow this version of the story, which was cemented in audience imaginations in 1950. The basic storyline comes from the French tale Cendrillon ou la petite pantoufle de verre, which translates roughly to Cinderella, or the little glass slipper, which was published in 1697 by Charles Perrault, a very famous purveyor of folklore. His is not the earliest version, not by a long shot, but it is the one that introduces a lot of the key elements. The fairy godmother, the pumpkin carriage, and of course the glass slipper. There's a theory that is briefly mentioned in the film Ever After, that the glass slipper was a mishearing of the word ver, which means squirrel's fur, as ver, which sounds very similar and means glass. But most scholars reject this idea. The word for squirrel's fur didn't really come into usage until about 100 years after Perrault died, so it would have been hard for him to mishear a word that didn't exist. The one major difference from the Disney version is that her father is still very much alive in the Perrault version. Supposedly, he somehow doesn't realize how bad everyone's treating his daughter. Most of them all call her Cinder Wench, not even giving her the full name, but the youngest daughter has too much compassion and calls her Cinderella instead because it's a little bit nicer. And for her part, Cinderella is just too weak and too patient and too nice and meek and kind to do anything about it. Not that her father would have done anything anyway, because it comments in the story that he probably would have just beaten her for insubordination because he is completely wrapped around the finger of the, once again, wicked stepmother. You can see the influence of the French on the architecture throughout the Disney film. You've got fleur-de-lis just plastering the walls. The narrator mentions they're in a chateau. They're very obviously setting it in France, even though they very deliberately never say that it's France, but it's France. It's France. The other version that usually gets referenced in the film versions is, of course, the ubiquitous Grimm brothers version, Aschenputtel. The first published in the 1812 collections of Grimm's fairy tales and then revised over and over and over and over and over and over the course of their 17 editions, published between 1812 and 1864. These guys really like to hit that cash cow hard. They are the early Disney. 1998's Ever After is one of the most obvious about this, beginning as it does with a frame story where the Grimm brothers themselves make an appearance. Both it and the 2015 version use a scene from Aschenputtel, which was not in the Perrault version, to draw a clear distinction between the stepdaughters and Cinderella. The father, who is always a traveling merchant, asks the girls what gifts they want him to bring back. And the two spoiled stepsisters, of course, ask for ridiculous gold and jewels and pearl dresses and all sorts of incredibly lavish, expensive baubles. Cinderella, however, asks only for the first branch that knocks against him on his way back. The movies don't really do much with this other than use it to draw a comparison that the stepsisters are all spoiled rotten, whereas Cinderella just wants her father back and she's a good person. But in the original story, in the Grimm versions, she actually plants that branch after he dies, and the spirit of her mother inhabits the tree, grows into a massive tree because it's watered by the tears that she sheds when she comes and visits it every day to complain about how bad she's treated. And instead of a fairy godmother, it's the spirit of her mother who actually ends up giving her all of the things through birds that drop them down from the top of a tree, which means the very great image of these little birds carrying this giant dress just trying to get there. So the 1950s animated version does make an oblique reference at the end to the Grimm version, though heavily sanitized for comedic effect. The elder stepdaughter tries on the shoes, but can't get her big toe in because the shoe is just too small for her. In the original, the stepmother pulls her aside and says, look, when you're queen, you won't need to walk. Cut it off. So she does. She cuts her toes off. And now her foot is able to be shoved into the shoe. And the princess is like, oh, the shoe fits. Great. You must be the woman that I fell in love with just yesterday, but I have no idea what you look like. And he puts her on his horse and he rides off, and they're about to go get married. Except that the birds of the forest start tweeting at him, hey, dude, seriously, look down. Just look down. And he does. And the shoe is just filling with blood, just lots and lots of blood. And he's like, well, that's not supposed to happen. That's not good. And so he takes off the shoe, finds the missing toe, and goes, oh, I see what happened. Okay. And he goes back. And he's like, okay, well, let's try the other stepsister. And she has the same problem, except this time it's her heel that won't get in the shoe. And the stepmother, having learned absolutely nothing, goes, when you're queen, you won't need to walk. Cut it off. And the stepsister, who also learned absolutely nothing, does so. And then the prince, who somehow also learned absolutely nothing, doesn't notice, puts her on his horse, rides off. And once again, it's the birds to save the day going, no, dude, seriously, did you look down? Look down. And he does. He's like, oh, it's blood again. Oh, it's blood again. All right, fine. Let's go back. And they circle back and they go try it on again. And he's like, is there anybody else? No, of course there's not. Of course there's nobody else. And of course there's eventually Cinderella who tries on the shoe, hopefully after they cleaned it out, because that's a lot of blood. In the Disney version, Drizella shoves her foot in, but her toes keep popping out with a comedic little sound. And then when Anastasia actually shoves her foot in there and holds it up, her heel kicks out and kicks the whole shoe across the thing and breaks it. Both get caught, but at least they get to keep their feet intact, and they can walk after. They're going to be okay. The other element that is often used from the Grimm version is the one we saw in the animated version, the impossible task of the false bargain. In Aschenputtel, the wicked stepmother empties a dish of lentils, which if you haven't seen them are very tiny before they're cooked, into the ashes. If Cinderella can pick them all out in 2 hours, she can go to the ball. This is intentionally impossible. But with the help of the birds that she has befriended, they flutter down and they all pick out the lentils one by one with dozens of birds, and they're able to pull it off. And this is a very clear reference to the Greek myth of Psyche and Eros, which is also brought up in the Sondheim musical Into the Woods. They do the very same scene with this really cool song. It's a lot of fun to see it on stage. But in Psyche and Eros, the trial is organized not by the girl's wicked stepmother, but by her mother-in-law-to-be, Aphrodite and or Venus, depending on whether you want the Greek or the Roman, who is very angry at the girl, who is named Psyche, or Soul, for betraying the trust of her son Eros, or Cupid, but not a baby. He's winged, but he's not a baby. He's a grown man. Because she accidentally burns him with oil lanterns because he's been doing this whole thing where he's like, you can't look at me, I'm a monster. And she's like, okay, that's fine. And then her sisters go, no, you have to look at him. What if he's a monster? He's going to eat you. And she's like, oh, no, I don't want to be it. So she goes and sneaks a look at him, and turns out, nope, he's beautiful. But in doing so, she accidentally burns his shoulder with the oil and almost gets the whole thing called off. It's a whole thing. But there, Aphrodite tosses a mix of wheat, barley, poppy seed, chickpeas, lentils, and beans onto the ground and demands that they be sorted by dawn, or else she will be executed, which are higher stakes. And again, Psyche is able to befriend the animals, in this case, ants, who swarm over and do all of the heavy lifting for her. Psyche and Eros really has a lot more in common with another French tale, specifically that Beauty and the Beast. But this particular scene keeps showing up. So the Perrault and the Grimm versions are definitely the most famous ones, but they are not the oldest or the only versions. There are thousands of variants of this tale that have been told all over the world. The oldest surviving version of Cinderella is the story of Rodopus from ancient Egypt, which was written down by the Greek geographer Strabo sometime around 7 BC, but dates back to at least the 6th century BC from the lost histories of Herodotus. It's a very short story, so I want to get into it because it's a very cool version to see how old this story really is. So long ago, in the land of Egypt near the Nile River, there lived a girl named Rodopus. She had been born in Egypt, but as often happened in the ancient world, she was kidnapped by pirates and sold into slavery. Her master was a kind old man, but he spent most of his time sleeping under a tree, so he never saw how abusive all the other servants were to her, as usual. They called her names and made her do all the hardest work, and they called her ugly a lot because they hated her curvy golden hair instead of their beautifully straight black hair, her green eyes instead of having their lustrous brown eyes, and for having pale skin that burns easily in the sun instead of the copper skin that, doesn't, given that it's Egypt and that's a problem. She had no friends but the local animals, again, as always. She had trained the birds to eat from her hand. She had a monkey who would sit on her shoulder, and she even had an old hippo who would waddle up out of the mud and hang out with her. And this last is by far the most impressive because if you don't know, hippos are mean. Hippos are real mean, and they will absolutely murder you just for being in the wrong place. So in pretty much every version, Cinderella does have a way with animals, sort of a way to show what a good person she is, and that she's pure of heart, and that she's in tune with nature, and that she is a good person worthy of all the good things that are eventually going to happen to her when she gets through all the pain. So this Rodopus was out dancing one night, as she often did, late at night when no one was around because she didn't want to be made fun of more. And her master woke up and saw her twirling and spinning, and he thought she was maybe the best dancer he'd ever seen. And he thought that someone that good a dancer shouldn't be going barefoot. So he bought her a really nice pair of shoes, like the finest leather, brocaded in rose gold, absolutely gorgeous, and of course finer than anything any of the other servants' girl had, so they hate her even more. One day, word came that the pharaoh was holding court in the city of Memphis, not that Memphis, and that all of his people were invited to attend the festival. Rodopus wanted desperately to go because she knew there would be singing and dancing and incredible food that she, as a slave, did not get to have any other time. But the other slave girls were heading there and gave her instead a bunch of chores to do so that she couldn't go because they're just mean like that. And being the good, meek, kind girl that she is, she stayed behind and she did all the extra washing. And so she went down, as they pull away on the river, she stays there and starts washing the clothes in the river, singing her a sad, sad song, which annoys the hippo, because I told you they're mean. And he wades back out into the river and splashes her shoes. And water is not good for leather. It's really not good for leather. So she panics and is worried that her great shoes are about to be ruined. So she takes them off immediately and sets them out to go dry. And wouldn't you know it, a falcon swoops out of the sky and takes one of them because he wanted something shiny. And he flies off with it. So now she's got one shoe, and one shoe is not terribly useful. Now, the falcon just happens to be the sacred bird of the god Horus, the god of the sky, and his hieroglyph was actually a falcon. That was his name, was a falcon. And the slave girl knew all of this, of course, and so she suspected this might be a sign from Horus, so she wasn't that mad. Confused, maybe, but not mad. Over in Memphis, the pharaoh was sitting on his throne, looking over his people and feeling very, very bored with all the pomp and circumstance. He would much rather be out riding his chariot in the wide expanse of the desert, when suddenly that same falcon dove out of the sky and dropped a shoe in his lap, which is weird even for a pharaoh. But he also recognized the falcon and went, oh, this must be a sign from the gods. Okay, cool. I'm going to have a decree out. Whoever this slipper fits is going to be my queen, because why not? And so they sent out a party all along the kingdom looking for who the shoe fits. And of course, they don't find anybody. They eventually go to the poorer parts of town up along the river and eventually come to this particular settlement where all the other servant girls rush out and are super happy. But of course, Rodopus is hiding in the reeds because she never just comes right out and takes what she wants. Unfortunately, as soon as she saw him bring out the shoe, she recognized it as hers, but she didn't say anything because, again, she's just too nice. No one was able to get their foot into the shoe because she had very tiny feet, and they also recognized that this was her shoe, but again, they're mean, and so they didn't say anything. He eventually gives up, and he starts to ride off, and he sees her hiding in the bushes, and he's like, wait, why are you hiding in the bushes? And also, maybe you should try on the shoe. And she does, and it fits, and now she's the queen. Long live the queen. And the pharaoh declared that she was the most Egyptian of all. Her eyes were as green as the Nile, her hair was as feathery as papyrus, and her skin was as pink as a lotus flower, which really pissed off the other servants. So as you can see, most of the classic elements of the traditional Cinderella story are already present in this really ancient tale, as they are in a number of other versions from all over the world. You've got Cyclone Foosa of Malta, an orphan servant in the king's palace who goes to a ball as a princess thanks to a magic spell, wins the prince's heart, and is given 3 gifts. She bakes them into crostini, a baked good, and she gives them to the prince. And he then realizes that, oh, these are the gifts that I gave this mystery woman that I'm in love with. This serving woman that I didn't recognize must be the woman I'm in love with. Let's get married. Then, of course, you've got Yijan of the Tang Dynasty, China, which dates back to about 890 or so, which is the first introduction of the wicked stepmother. Yijan's mother had died in childbirth, leaving the second wife of her father, the chief. Which at that time, chiefs typically married 2 women for exactly this sort of reason. And so Jin had to raise her along with her cruel half sister Junli. Her father, of course, dies of a plague. That is often the way he goes, forcing Yijan to become a servant to her stepmother. She befriends a beautiful 10-foot-long fish with golden scales and beautiful golden eyes, who is, of course, the reincarnated spirit of her mother, another thing that keeps coming back. But her stepmother and her half-sister kill the fish out of jealousy by tricking Yijan into giving Junli her tattered dress. So she takes that dress and goes and pretends to be her sister. The fish comes out, and she kills it because she's super jealous that she has anything they don't have. Yijan does eventually find the bones of her mother fish, thanks to the spirit of an old man who is probably magical, and the bones themselves are also magical. And they dress her in finery for a New Year's festival, which of course she is forbidden to attend, including a pair of golden shoes. Her stepfamily, for once, recognizes that it's just their relative in newer clothes. Finally, someone is not tricked out by a fancy new dress and goes, "No, wait, I know you." And she panics and she flees the island, of course, leaving behind both of her shoes in this case. And the shoe, just the one shoe. It is just the one shoe. And of course, since she lost one shoe, the magical fish bones no longer speak to her because that's the way it works with magic. So eventually, the shoe gets picked up, and it's a very tiny shoe, which in Tang Dynasty, China, tiny feet were a sign of attractiveness, and the tinier the better. And these were extremely tiny shoes. So everybody's like, "Oh, this is really interesting." So it gets passed from person to person, sold around, and eventually it makes it to a local prince who is not actually at the festival. And he becomes enamored with the owner of this shoe, and he decides he's going to find this mystery woman. But he doesn't. And so he eventually gives up and builds a little monument and puts the shoe in the middle, hoping that someone will eventually find it and come try it on and he'll know. Yijan sees this and realizes that's her missing shoe, and she kind of wants the pair because maybe her fish bones will talk to her again. And so she sneaks out to try to steal it. And of course, she gets caught, and they're all like, "Oh, you're a thief. You're trying to steal this shoe." And she's like, No, it's my shoe. I'm like, "Yeah, sure. Of course it's your shoe. Everyone says it's theirs when they're caught stealing." No, really. Here's the other one. And they're like, "Oh, it is your shoe." Married. There are several versions of this story. Most of them, in this case, end with the stepmother and the stepsister becoming more impoverished themselves, and they end up fighting amongst each other as to who has to serve who, and the screams get so loud they cause a cave-in, rocks fall, everybody dies. There are also several variants in the 1001 Nights from Scheherazade, all with younger siblings being harassed and abused by elder siblings, though this is the first time we get a male version of Cinderella, with Abdallah ibn Fadil and his brothers, and the tragic Dudar and his brethren. There's also a Vietnamese story of Tam Cam, which is very similar to Yijan, and countless others. It's one of those stories that shows up all around the world in different incarnations, but so many of the elements are weirdly very similar. If you've ever heard my podcast, you already know that I love to give Disney crap for sanitizing their old movies. This is one of the few where they really didn't have to change the story to make it kid-friendly. For the most part, the old tales were very much not intended for kids. They were directed at adults as morality tales, as reinforcements of the proper way for the nobility to act. And if you look at, like, say, Sleeping Beauty, that is absolutely not kid-friendly at all. That one had to be heavily sanitized to be a Disney film. And when you watch it, having read that, you find yourself cringing a few times, being like, "Oh, no, that's not, don't do that." The most blood-soaked of the tales usually are the Grimm brothers, which most people know of as being kind of dark gruesome tales. And then, of course, the Italian Pentamerone of Giambattista Basile, which is where Sleeping Beauty comes from. Cinderella, on the other hand, lifts from the Perrault version almost entirely, with a few of the more pleasant touches from the Grimm brothers, right down to Cinderella being incredibly passive. So, in preparation for this, I recently rewatched the 1950s version, and I think she only really makes one decision in the entire movie. And of course, that one decision is the one that gets her caught and locked up in the attic and almost missing out on her true happiness. After having danced with the prince, she refuses to wash her stepfamily's clothes for the first time ever and dances away, which is the only reason Lady Tremaine realizes that this is the mystery woman, because she's humming a song that was played at the ball, which Cinderella couldn't possibly have known, so she must have been there. So standing up for herself almost gets her entire thing ruined. Coming as this movie did not long after the end of World War II, it struck a cultural note that resonated with the Perrault version. Only by putting your own desires aside and doing your duty can you be worthy for your reward, which is bestowed upon you by fate, not your own actions. Every time anyone tries to force events to go their own way, it backfires. Lady Tremaine tries to keep the prince from Cinderella and accidentally reveals her instead. Lucifer the cat, which is such an on-the-nose name for an evil cat, but I love it, tries to protect the dressmaking material and also eat the mice, and ends up being able to do neither of those things. And then you've got Perrault's version, which explicitly states at the end of the story that a woman's beauty is a treasure, but graciousness is priceless. Without it, nothing is possible. With it, one can do anything. However, all these talents are worthless without also having the blessing of a godmother. Cinderella wins the prince, who barely speaks in the entire film, because she is worthy, so everything just kind of works out because it's meant to, because they're good people. And that's all you got to have, is just be good people and do the right thing, and things will just work out. Before Perrault's edition of the fairy godmother, however, Cinderella was actually a much more active participant in her own fate. So you got Yijan, who does get a magical assist from her fish, but she does most of the decisions on her own. She decides to steal the shoe. All the wishes are her wish. She's the one that wants to go to the ball. She's the one that decides what she's going to have. It's all her own choices. She ends up actually walking to the festival on her own by her own feet, because she just wants to be there and doesn't have a way to get there. And in Basile's version from 1634, Centrantola, or La Gata Centrantola, the heroine Zazzola is a clever trickster. And I do love me a trickster character. I love tricksters. This is the version that was turned into an opera by Rossini. So here is probably the introduction of the idea of the nickname Cinderella, as the story's name comes from the Italian word cinere, which means ash or cinder, and refers to the servants and scullery maids who would be stained with ash from their duties. Because at the time, ash was used to scour out pots after cooking so that you could get all the grime and grit out of there. And so the scullery maids would become absolutely coated in ash and cinders. And thus, and also the whole thing that I mentioned before about them sleeping next to the hearth and getting coated in fireplace cinders. And so, yeah, she's Cinderella because she is covered in cinders. The original title translates roughly to Cat Cinderella, referring to how she was as clever and determined as a cat. In this version, Zazzola's father is himself a prince. After his first wife dies, he remarries a wicked woman who becomes jealous of his daughter. She confides in her governess and wishes that that the governess had become her stepmother instead. Mistake! The governess thinks this is a grand idea and conspires with Zazzola to murder the wicked stepmother. She asks the stepmother to get her a tattered old dress from a large chest in the attic to save the nice one she got from her mother. The wicked mother is super on board with yeah, dress you in really awful rags? Yeah, I'm on board with that. So she goes up there, she starts rummaging around this heavy chest, and Zazzola reaches up, takes the lid, slams it down, and breaks her neck, killing her. This is not Cinderella, folks. She is absolutely going to murder people to get her way. She then begins to talk to her dad about how great the governess is and how he really should look at marrying her maybe instead. And he really had never looked at the governess twice, but you know what? If his daughter says she's a good person, that's good enough for me. Mistake. Turns out that the governess is even more wicked than the first stepmother. And this is a Wicked Stepmother Part 2 Electric Boogaloo. More wicked, more boogaloo. So she ends up meeting a magical dove for no reason, just why not, who promises her a wish from the dove of the fairies on the island of Sardinia, like you do. Turns out the governess actually has 6 daughters of her own that nobody knew about. And after a single week of being nice to Zazola, she brings her own children in and begins being even crueler than the previous stepmother. Her father, however, is absolutely besotted with this new woman and doesn't pay any attention when she gets turned into a servant in her own household. And even though she's supposedly a princess, she's now a scullery maid. The prince ends up going to Sardinia on affairs of state and asks all the daughters what they want to bring back. Like in the other versions we've seen, they all ask for expensive trinkets and dresses and gems and all sorts of fun stuff. Zazola is more practical and asks that he give her good wishes to the dove of the fairies and ask her to send something back. And she warns her father that if he forgets her request, he will be stuck and unable to move forwards or backwards. Naturally, being kind of a jerk, he does in fact forget completely. And he gets on his ship after everything is done, loading up with all the gifts for everybody else, but completely forgetting his actual daughter, and tries to sail off and away. And the boat don't move at all. And eventually he's getting frustrated and, yelling at the sailors. The sailors are like, no, there's no reason this boat shouldn't be moving. There is magic going on. He's like, oh yeah, magic. That reminds me. I was supposed to say something to the fairies. And they're like, oh, well then go do that. And they kick him off the boat and force him to go actually give Zazola's regards to the fairies because they want to go home too. So the fairy dove queen mother person is extremely happy about getting these very friendly regards from Zazola, and they send her back a bunch of gifts. Specifically a date tree, a hoe, a golden bucket, and a silken napkin. One of these things is not like the other. Zazola is delighted by her gifts and uses all of them to plant this particular tree. Again, not quite sure how the handkerchief plays into it, but it does. Maybe she just wipes her brow with it afterwards. I don't know. The story doesn't really say, but somehow she definitely uses it to plant a tree. The tree grows huge in only a few days, and out steps a fairy who grants her a wish to be able to leave the house without her sisters knowing. When a feast comes not long after, her stepmother and 6 stepsisters all set out in finery, leaving Zazola behind, but she gets herself a beautiful dress from her magic tree and a carriage and takes herself to the ball. The king who was hosting eventually becomes besotted with Zazola, and this is not her father the prince, this is a different king. There are a lot of royals in this story. And he ends up sending a servant to follow this woman that he has not actually spoken to. She was just dancing at the ball and decided that he really liked her and he wants to, have her stick around. And she sees the servant following her, kind of figures out what the deal is, decides she's not necessarily into this. And she had asked the tree for some extra gold pieces just in case, so she tosses a few gold pieces behind her and makes her way. The servant, of course, being a servant, is not paid super great. And so he's like, I could follow this mystery woman, or I could take gold pieces. And of course, he takes the gold pieces because who wouldn't? It's gold pieces. And the king is absolutely enraged that the servant makes the choice to, not starve. And he kind of forgets that everyone is not as rich as he is and can just ask for food and just get it. And so he orders him to follow her again at the next ball, assuming she shows up. And the next day, they have another ball. And of course, Zazola does, in fact, show up. But this time she planned ahead, figured the gold pieces might be enough incentive, and so she brought jewels and pearls that are far more valuable. And when the servant starts following her the second time, she tosses those behind him. And again, he's like, nope, can't turn that down. That's worth a lot of money. That's worth like several years of working. And so he stops and picks up all the stuff, and she makes her escape. And of course, again, the king is furious rather than just paying him more so this won't happen. And threatens to beat the servant, possibly to death, if he fails one more time. And that's a pretty good motivator. So the third time she starts to flee, he ignores everything she throws behind her and is racing, just booking it after her, trying to catch her. And so she realizes she doesn't have time for any more tricks at this point, and she just runs, books it as well. She's in pretty good shape, but she does lose a shoe in the process. But she does make it to her carriage and is able to ride off just in time. And the servant brings back the shoe as proof that, look, I tried. Really tried. Please don't hurt me. The king is frustrated, but he does seem to appreciate that the servant really did make his best effort. And so he holds a new feast, this time to try the slipper on every woman's foot, but of course it doesn't fit anyone. The king despairs and orders everyone to bring absolutely any woman in the kingdom, no matter who she might be. And the prince is like, oh yeah, I do kind of have this daughter that I didn't bring because I realized that I'm kind of a bad father. But you don't want to see her, right? And he's like, what part of every woman didn't you understand? Every woman, bring her. And as soon as Isola walks in the door, the shoe flies out of the servant's hand and lands on her foot. And they're like, well, that is as clear a sign as you're going to get. You are the woman I'm going to marry. Zozola is the spiritual ancestor of the version from 1998's Ever After, as is Finette Cendron from Marie Catherine Delny's 1697 story. This version of Cinderella is named Finette Auriel, or a shrewd listener, but is nicknamed Finette, or Little Clever Girl. She is still exceptionally kind, as Cinderella often is, but that isn't the reason she triumphs. She wins because she's clever, and because she's able to trick the wicked people and then is kind to them, which makes them hilariously angry. Which both is played for comedy, and also the more angry you are, the more mistakes you make, and the easier it is to trick people. She's a really great little trickster character. And again, I love tricksters. As one of the few recent non-Disney versions of the story, Ever After is able to take a few more liberties with the story and strays a lot more from the Perrault version than any of the Disney adaptations do. So Danielle is a fiery, self-assured woman who puts up with the cruelty of her stepmother in order to protect her beloved family's home as well as she can, as well as to honor her dying father's wishes. This Danielle is the total opposite of the Cinderella of the 1950s. It overtly references the Grimm brothers of the Grimm brothers version, including the appearance of the Grimm versions, but there is no magic, no stepmother, no pumpkin carriage. It's just her and her wits making this all work. So she first meets the prince by pelting him with an apple, thinking he's a thief. She accidentally convinces him that she's a courtier, only because she risks arrest to save a servant and goes in finery and her mother's old clothes and pretends to be a courtier so she can buy her servant who's been sold by her stepmother to pay off her stepmother's debts. And ends up accidentally running into the prince and is like, oh yeah, no, totally a courtier. Not at all weird. It's super illegal for me to pretend to be a courtier if I'm not. So, yep, definitely a courtier. Definitely a thing. She ends up quoting philosophy and debates the prince on the proper way to rule, telling him that he's being a pretty bad prince, the way he's acting, which no one tells him he's bad at being a prince. You don't do that because, he's the prince. And she actively fights for herself and her desires on several occasions, punching her wicked stepsister Marguerite and drawing a sword on the wicked Pierre Lepew, who I still think is a reference to Pepe Le Pew. He's French. It's all there. I'm pretty sure that's Pepe Le Pew. So she's still a very kind woman who risks herself to protect her servants, but kindness is not the reason she gets her dreams in the end. Even after being betrayed by her stepmother, she saves herself and meets the prince on his way to save her, but she didn't end up needing him. She saved herself. So Danielle is definitely part of a trend of more recent adaptations, giving Cinderella a lot more agency in her story. No longer is she the utterly passive passenger in her own life who can't do anything to make her life better without help from fairies and animals. Beginning with 1997's Disney remake for The Wonderful World of Disney, starring Brandy as Cinderella and based heavily on the Rodgers and Hammerstein version, which is, of course, the musical. The new modern versions tend to subvert the themes of the earlier ones. Here you have Whitney Houston's fairy godmother explicitly saying that magic can only get Cinderella to the ball. She has to do the rest. You have to do it yourself. No more can Cinderella rely on her wish coming true because she's obedient and kind. She has to actually make choices and take risks to make something happen. This is also the beginning of a trend of humanizing the wicked stepmother. In older versions, it's simply taken for granted that the stepmother is cruel and wasteful and jealous. And this is somewhat a reference to the idea of if you marry someone who has their own kids, they're going to be jealous of the line of succession and often trying to eliminate the earlier children who are a threat to their children being able to actually take over the estate, take over any titles. And so stepmothers were often seen as sort of a threat to the proper lines of succession, which is why this keeps showing up as a theme inside of fairy tales. But in the 1997 version, you got Bernadette Peters, who's the first one to really get a backstory and a motivation. She is a parody of the 50s version of ideal femininity that the animated Cinderella embodies. She coaches her daughters to hide their flaws until after marriage, and it's clear she's deeply bitter about her husband's death and is taking out her pain on the stepdaughter who embodies everything that she's lost.
The song Falling in Love with Love was added to the show from another Rogers song, which is from the Boys from Syracuse, explicitly to show that the stepmother isn't just evil, she's been hurt by lost love. She seems to genuinely think that she's protecting Cinderella from being mocked by everyone at the ball. Well, this is one of the few versions where there is no false bargain. She never tells Cinderella she can go to the ball. She's always telling her, no, you can't go. It's going to be bad. It's going to get you hurt. You're better off not going. She's wrapped up in her own bitterness and superiority, which makes her more human and believable. Like, she's still not a good person, but she's a real person. She's an understandable person. You can understand where she's coming from. You get a similar theme with the Baroness Rodmilla de Ghent from Ever After, initially trying to be a good mother as well as she can, which isn't great, but she's trying. She came from extremely high privilege and is not adjusting well to this country manor, as they put it, which is, it's a mansion. It's a mansion, guys. It is, and they're worried that there are going to be barnyard animals tramping through it like it's a pigsty. I'm like, are you seeing the same house I'm seeing? Anyway, the death of her husband, of the husband she clearly loves, and his dying decision to give his final words to his daughter rather than his wife, who are both right there, really starts to cement her bitterness towards her new stepdaughter, who is getting the love that she always was trying to get and the acceptance that she was trying to get. She can't adjust to her new life, and she grows resentful of everything that's happening to her and takes it out on the stepdaughter. We get a nice little nod to the Perrault version in Ever After, with the younger stepdaughter, Jacqueline, being much kinder to Danielle, and thus avoiding the punishment that is meted out to her crueler stepfamily at the end. The 2015 version, which is also a Disney version, because a lot of these are Disney versions, tries to walk a line between the classic animated version and the more modern takes in the story. You've still got the animated magical animals, including fan favorite Gus Gus, and I'm really glad they kept Gus Gus. I love Gus Gus. But we also get to meet Ella's mother for the first time. Lady Tremaine, Anastasia, Drizella, and Lucifer the Cat all show up, but they are a mix of the one-dimensional villains from 1950 and the complex humans of Ever After. This step family is spoiled and biased against the country, just like the Baroness, calling a huge mansion a squalid farmhouse that they expect animals to just wander through. This father doesn't die immediately, but has a chance to be the father from the story of the version that we discussed earlier, working himself harder and staying away longer, trying to meet the increasingly impossible demands of his new wife. This Lady Tremaine overhears Ella complaining to her father about her new family, and worse, hears him call them trying and difficult, and complaining of how much he misses his dead wife. And that puts that seed of bitterness that this daughter, this Cinderella, is the one keeping her separated from the love of her husband that she really, really wants. And then, of course, when he dies, not there long after, she ends up locking Ella in the attic, which is as much about getting rid of everything that reminds her of him and reminds her even more of the dead mother as she possibly can, and that very much includes Ella. Not to mention, she's putting the crazy woman who thinks she can talk to animals up in the attic, which was absolutely a thing people did at that point in time. This is the first version I've seen where Ella actually gets the name Cinderella. All of the others either have her called that all the way through, or they never call her that. So this newer trend marks a reversal of the changes all through Perrault and Grimm. In the older version, Cinderella keeps getting downgraded to a more and more passive position, reliant on beauty and fate to get her out of a bad situation instead of her own wits and courage. This trend to weaken Cinderella is most marked in the 17 revisions of the Grimm brothers made to their book of fairy tales that I mentioned earlier. In the 1812 version, Cinderella has 12 lines of direct speech, while her stepmother and the prince have 4 apiece. By 1857, Cinderella has had her lines cut in half, and by 1864 is completely silent. She doesn't have a single line in the 1864 version. On the other hand, the prince is up to 11 lines, and the stepmother is up to 12. This reflects a belief, one that can still be seen very much in the 1950s version, that good girls are silent while wicked women and bold men speak up. As Cinderella loses her voice, she also loses her agency, and she ceases to be the clever cat trickster who makes her own way. She gets a nice chunk of dialogue back in the animated movie, and women actually get the majority of lines in the movie, unlike most of the modern Disney princess movies, which have a distinct problem with men speaking more than women. Despite the princesses being, the theoretical leads of these movies, they still somehow talk less. But she still has no agency. The newer adaptations keep much of the dialogue with the women in these stories, and they're slowly making them more interesting and complex characters with motivation and choices. I'm very curious to see how this newest version is going to end up playing out. So I'm looking forward to seeing that after con at this point because it is apparently out now. So at this point, I'm going to open up the floor to questions either about Cinderella or broader mythology, folklore, fairy tales, Disney animated movies in general. Yes.
Not so much a question, just reading up on it. The reason that the handkerchief was there is date trees, once they have grown, don't do well with moisture.
Oh, well, there you go. That's why the silk handkerchief is there, is so that you can wipe down the moisture so that the date trees can grow. I did not know that. Well, thank you for that. I had no idea about that. Yes.
It's interesting when you look at kind of and I don't know if you have thoughts of this, especially as kind of they shift and go back and forth. The way you have Cinderella is a really good example, but it's not the only example of Disney almost not only making kind of a definitive version, but even subsuming other definitive versions. Like the Rodgers and Hammerstein musical was much more prominent, like in my life as a child growing up. But then Disney made the remake with Brandy. So like they almost took it over. They did a similar thing with Sleeping Beauty, where the music is literally Tchaikovsky's ballet, which should be public domain, but they've now basically copyrighted. Like, so like, what do you think that means maybe for the continued evolution of these fairy tales?
I mean, well, the one good thing is that the original stories are public domain, and so they, as much as the House of Mouse loves to get litigious, they can't stop you from taking Perrault. They can't stop you from taking Grimm. So as long as you don't take any of the specific things that they added, like you can do as many Snow Whites as you want, but you can't name the seven dwarfs the same names that Disney came up with. So it does put a little bit of a damper on it, but there is also plenty of room to play with. I mean, like I said, there's over 100 adaptations of Cinderella. It is a very popular film to keep getting remade, often in ways that are not necessarily overtly referenced in the titles and in the plot lines. But when you start paying attention to it, you realize it is just a remake of Cinderella. And you see the same thing to a lesser extent with some of the Shakespeare stuff, which was big in the late 90s with a lot of the teen comedies based off of Shakespearean comedies and occasionally Shakespearean tragedies, which is an interesting choice. But yeah, and I think it's a good question.
If they're not on mic, the stream won't hear it.
Gotcha. I will repeat the question from that point on. Thank you. We have other questions.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. I didn't realize there was a mic there. Yes.
Out the middleman a little bit. About the Egyptian version, when did you said that was documented by later Greeks, is that right?
Correct. Yeah, it was a Greek geographer from around 6 BC who wrote down the story, which was being told orally at that point. He got the story from, at the time, existing but now lost to us, histories by the Greek historian Herodotus from the 6th century BC. And
Gotcha.
we've got a lot of stories, more in the Greek pantheon, where we have people referencing stories. And so we know a little bit about what he was writing, but we don't have the actual texts.
Right. I asked that because do you think that I noticed in the version you were telling a lot of playing up of not exactly Egyptian physical characteristics being deemed as beautiful and pure. And I'm wondering if you think some of that is the inherent bias of the Greek documentation, or maybe that it was, if I'm remembering my history right, that's post Alexander the Great coming in and shoving in the Ptolemies in there.
Yeah.
So do you think that the description of more European physical characteristics as beautiful is something of Greece slipping in there?
It's definitely something of Greece slipping in there. I think it's probably your second point is probably more at that point that you had the Ptolemy dynasty up on the throne. And if you look at Egyptian history and the Egyptian mythology and the way it evolves, particularly with like the lost pharaoh and the attempt to move away from Amun to a different god and then coming back to it and his name being stricken from the record, the pharaohs very much set the tone of what are acceptable stories, and the stories change to match whoever's on the throne.
Right.
So with the Greek Ptolemaic dynasty being up there, yes, I do think that they
Yeah.
probably played up the Greek attributes. Rodopus very well may not have been Greek initially, but by the time we get that story, it has been the
Mhm.
official version.
Written by the victors and all.
Exactly.
Just
Writ-
my last point on that is just when you said, when it got to the end and it's like, oh, I think your features are perfectly embodying of Egypt, that your light hair and your light features, people who have these features are totally the rightful leaders of Egypt, you guys. I promise it's not just colonialism.
Oh yeah, no, that's definitely intentional and probably spliced on at the end.
Thank you.
Hello.
Hello.
I wanted to know your opinions on the 2006 classic Happily Never After.
Happily Ever After.
Never After.
Happily Never After. I don't know if I've seen Happily
Oh.
Never After.
It's something.
Okay, now I have to check this out. I have not seen that one.
It's got like a 4 on Rotten Tomatoes, which I think is a great score.
That's amazing.
Yeah. Okay.
I mean, is it a fun bad movie?
Yes.
Okay, see, I love fun bad movies.
Animated, isn't it? Yeah.
Oh, I'm gonna watch that.
Hey, so you mentioned on Cinderella, the fact that the evil stepmother is evil is just kind of obvious because of the whole bloodline who's going to inherit thing. But it does seem like there's a theme on the very early version of Cinderella. Her dad's just either painfully oblivious or a jackass, one of the two.
Yep.
And then eventually they decide, we can't make the dad bad, so we have to kill him. Like, do you think where that tipping point was of, well, we've got to make the dad nice, or it's just unrealistic, like he wouldn't care that his daughter's being a scullery maid, so now we must kill him to make the story work?
Yeah, it starts sometime around the later Grimm brothers, because the earlier versions before that typically, well, the super old versions, you often have the father dead. And then he starts being callous and uncaring for quite a while, particularly in the Italian versions, and then the French versions. And then when it comes back to the Germans, it goes back to the father got to be dead. And some of that probably ties into what's going on culturally and what's going on historically in those particular regions. Because at the time the Grimm brothers were writing, there was a lot of difficulty with agriculture. There was the beginning of the switch to modernization in the Rhineland. And so you had the father who was they were trying to push this idea that the father needs to be this great protector. And so you can't have him be a bad dude. It undercuts this whole narrative. So he's got to be dead. Whereas in the Italian areas, it's much more of that's a time of plenty. It's a time of warring city-states, the different powerful families all against one another. And so there you can absolutely be like, oh, no, that's not one of our bad dads. That's his bad dad. It's one of those guys. And so I think a lot of it has to do with what's going on culturally, where the story is being told, when it's being told.
Okay.
Hi.
Hello.
Okay, so I know that in Into the Woods, their Cinderella goes to 3 balls over 3 days. Is
Mhm.
there a basis in Western Cinderella stories doing this, or is it more of an amalgamation of other stories?
No, that comes from the Zozola version, where she does go to 3 balls in 3 days, each time outwitting the servant and by casting finery behind her. And so there's also the whole idea that in a lot of the ancient fairy tales, 3 was a mystical number. So it was all common to have 3 wishes or 3 items or 3 days. And so in this case, I think it's both tapping in Sondheim tapping into that idea of the mystical number of 3, as well as bringing in that Zozola version, because the Into the Woods does a really good job of pulling a lot of the more obscure versions for their versions.
All right, thank you.
Anybody else?
You mentioned the kind of Greek mythological influences are on specifically Cinderella. You also mentioned Beauty and the Beast. Are there any other fairy tales that we would recognize as almost ubiquitous that have a similar kind of global reach and ancient reach?
that
Ooh.
come to mind?
I have to think about that for a second because, yeah, the Greek myths are one of those things that pop up a lot in the Western canon in different ways. The Arthurian legend does a lot with revamping the old Greek stories as well as picking up a lot from the Celtic stories. Specifically, you've got Caredwin the Witch showing up as Morgan Le Fay. You've got a lot of retooled gods that show up as usually magical characters instead. Trying to think of other Greek myths that would. I mean, you've got probably one that would be well known would be the story of My Fair Lady, which comes from a Greek myth, the story of Pygmalion. The original play by George Bernard Shaw is absolutely a deliberate reference to that. The play was originally called Pygmalion, and it's about the original myth. Pygmalion is a sculptor who creates this statue that is so beautiful that he falls in love with it and falls to weeping at the altar of Aphrodite because he can't find a woman as beautiful as the statue he's made. And so she brings the statue to life and they get married happily ever after. Don't think about it too hard. It's not creepy at all.
I shouldn't have said that far back. I'm wondering if you ever saw the Rooster Teeth show Ruby and their character Cinder, who's loosely based on Cinderella.
I don't know if I've seen it. I've read a comic book adaptation, I think. It may be a different version. They also call her Ruby and Cinder, so I'm not sure if it's the same or not.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, that's a very cool adaptation. I really enjoyed that variation with them sort of as monster hunters and sort of doing the playing on the big bad wolf idea of, the monsters don't get us, we get the monsters.
Right.
And I think that is a very fun concept to play around with. And I do think that is a really entertaining story. Anybody else? We got a few minutes left.
Do you have an actual question? I was just going to say some notes.
All right, go ahead. I'll go.
Again, this isn't necessarily a question. It's something that came up in my mind when the question about the father was asked. It's just interesting to me how the role of the father in the ones where he's not, dead is kind of counter to the message for Cinderella, and I suppose by extension for the women maybe, because his passivity and his letting things happen makes all the bad stuff happen, but Cinderella's passivity and letting things happen is letting it go to fate, letting the world take its course.
You're
it's
absolutely
just
right.
interesting to me to see how that's probably kind of a motivator for making him dead in other versions, so you don't have the contradicting morals.
True. Although they do also do in the versions where the father is sort of passive, he doesn't have many lines, because going back to the idea that bold men speak, so the good guys are the ones that do all the talking. The bad guys just kind of show up, don't do a whole lot, and then end up bad things happening to them.
True.
So clearly you've read Cinderella stories from all over the world and all over time. Which one do you think should be made into a movie, like not in the Disney kind of grim mold?
So which version do I think should be the definitive version? Was that the question?
Which version not should be the definitive version, just should kind of exist in more popular culture? Like which version,
Gotcha.
If someone was like, you get to make a Cinderella inspired movie, but it can't be at all inspired by the Grimm brothers or the 1950 Disney version. What do you make?
Yeah, I would love to see one with the trickster Cinderella, particularly like Zola actually killing the first stepmother. Like, I want to see that Cinderella. I want to see the one who is constantly undercutting people, tricking people, getting the better of people. I want that Cinderella. But again, I'm biased. I love tricksters. So that's always going to be my choice.
So towards the beginning of the panel, you mentioned how filtered or sanitized some of the other Disney films are compared to their originals. Are there any others that didn't have to be as sanitized as, say, like Beauty and the Beast, that are like Cinderella, and which ones would those be?
I mean, Beauty and the Beast actually isn't that heavily sanitized. It's just heavily condensed because the original story is massive and it just kind of wanders all over the place. The original La Bête et la Belle starts off at a war between two kingdoms that it goes over this whole like 20-year period that ends up with the Beast being made into the Beast specifically to protect him from the curse from this other evil witch who is trying to claim him as her stepson slash groomed lover. It's this whole weird subplot, and then there's a whole thing with the Belle character having these series of weird dreams where she falls in love with the Beast's human form, but then makes the choice to marry the Beast instead because it's the proper thing to do because he's a good person. It's a very wandering story. And so that one, I think, just had to be condensed purely for time because it's such a big story. But yeah, a lot of them do get cut down for content. Hercules in particular is bad about that, although they also pull up so many other stories. I'm like, that's not this story, guys. You didn't need to make 5 different. Hercules is cool enough on his own. You don't also need to bring in Pericles. You don't also need to bring in Perseus. Yeah.
Hello.
Hello.
One aspect of the story or the plot that I don't think gets a ton of questioning is why Cinderella wants to go to the ball in the first place, right? And this is where Ever After does a great job because she wants to go to the ball because she knows the prince, she's fallen in love with him, she needs to see him. Do you have any opinions on the different versions and they're providing that motivation, or should we just assume it's a party and girls like parties, right? And of course she wants to go to the ball, no reason beyond that.
I mean, some of it's that, and some of it is a throwback to the ancient fest days where if you were the servants, that was the one time you didn't have to work. That was the one day you really got to cut loose and eat and dance and just have fun and not have to work. And since she is cast in the servant role most of that time, it was in a lot of versions accepted that just wanting to go to the festival because it's a festival and she hasn't ever gotten to go to any festivals is enough motivation. But several of them do give her, like in the Rodopus version, it's specifically because she loves to dance, but she's never really had a chance to do so. And she wants to go to this big city to dance with people for the first time ever. Or like in the Zazola version, she just wants to go have fun and sneak out and get one over on everybody because it's as much about tricking everybody and doing it without them catching her as it is about the party itself.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. All right, we are coming up on time here, so I'm going to go ahead and call it. Thank you all for coming and for all the fantastic questions. Please remember to rate and review the sessions on the app. It really helps us out. And I've got business cards and stickers up here that are free to take. Feel free to come and take whatever you like. I will be, where will I be? I will be at the Mythic Quest panel over in the Marriott at 7 o'clock tonight. It is a fantastic show. It's going to be a fantastic panel.
I always love like mythology and unpacking different stuff. I took a course on Shakespeare and folktale influences when I was in college. It was so great. I loved it.
That sounds like
So I love dissecting these sorts of things.
Gotcha.
Can I leave my card?
Yeah, please.
Where was the Zola one from?
I believe that is the Cinderella version. Let me see. Let me find that. Make sure I'm not telling you wrong. Here we go. Zola is, yeah, that's Cinderella. I got the Cinderella. It's Basile.
Okay.